On the slave block of the Roman Forum, a senator's wife clutched her 5-year-old twins. Her name was gone. Her husband was executed. And now the auctioneer raised his hand to seal their fate, to separate them forever. The boy would be sent to the salt mines, the girl to a life of servitude. The crowd jeered, savoring the fall of a great house. But from the shadows, a scarred general, a man they called the Iron Ghost of the 9th Legion, stepped forward. As the gavel fell, his voice cut. Through the noise, cold and absolute, with a bid that stunned all of Rome. For more stories where Roman steel meets a heart of gold, join our legion by subscribing and let us know where our story has reached you. The dust of the Forum tasted of defeat. It settled on Livia's tongue, a gritty film that was the final flavor of her old life. The sun, a merciless eye in the sky, beat down on the wooden platform where she stood, baking the shame into her skin. Below her, Rome churned, a sea of faces once familiar were now twisted into masks of scorn, pity, or a cold, hungry curiosity. These were the same stones she had walked as the wife of Senator Decimus, her silk stola whispering against the ground. Now, the rough-spun wool of a slave's tunic scratched at her neck, her only possession besides the 2 small bodies pressed against her legs. Valerius and Valeria, her 5-year-old twins, were silent. They had learned silence quickly in the days since the Praetorian Guard had stormed their villa. Valeria's fingers were tangled in the folds of Livia's tunic, a desperate knot. Valerius stood rigid, his small chin trembling as he tried to mimic the stoic bravery his father had taught him. Livia's hands rested on their heads, a useless shield against the 1,000 hostile eyes that stripped them bare. She could feel the tremors that ran through their small frames, a fear so profound it had no need for tears. The auctioneer, a fleshy man named Cassian, reveled in the spectacle. He circled them like a vulture, his voice booming across the market square, dripping with false deference that was sharper than any insult. He pointed a fat finger at Livia. "Behold the noble Livia," he announced, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Her hands once played the lyre, now they can scrub your floors. Her voice once debated philosophy, now it can beg for your mercy." A wave of laughter rolled through the crowd. Livia flinched, but her gaze remained fixed on the horizon over the heads of the mob, toward the temple of Saturn. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She had been a Roman wife. She would show them the ghost of that dignity, even here. From the shaded portico of a nearby basilica, another man watched. Senator Tullius did not smile, for his triumph was too complete for such a simple expression. He watched with the placid satisfaction of a patient predator. It was he who had whispered the poison into the emperor's ear, he who had forged the documents that damned Decimus as a traitor. Seizing his rival's lands and titles was a simple matter of politics. This, however, this was art. Erasing a bloodline, grinding a noble family into dust under the public eye, ensured no vengeful son could ever rise to challenge him. The boy Valerius was a loose thread. Today he would be snipped. "Let us begin the bidding for the woman," the auctioneer roared. The offers came, low and vile. A brothel owner from the Subura shouted a price followed by a detailed list of the duties she would perform. A wealthy merchant, a man who had dined at her table, offered a pittance, suggesting she could serve as a tutor for his own spoiled children, a living lesson in humility. Each bid was a stone thrown at her, and Livia absorbed them, her posture unbending. Her mind had retreated to a quiet place, a memory of her husband's hand in hers, walking through their garden at dawn. That was real. This was a nightmare, but the nightmare sharpened when the auctioneer turned his attention to the children. "The woman is tainted by her traitorous husband," he declared, "but the children are fresh stock, unbroken. Let us start with the boy." Livia's world fractured. The stoic mask she had so carefully maintained shattered into a million pieces. A raw, guttural sound escaped her throat. "No," she whispered, the word a ragged prayer. She pulled Valerius behind her, shielding him with her body. "Not separately. Please, I beg you." The plea was a victory for the auctioneer. He had broken her. "Beggars have no say on this block," he sneered. "The boy goes to the highest bidder. He has a strong back. He will fetch a fine price for the salt mines." The salt mines. A death sentence. Livia saw it in her mind, her beautiful bright son, his skin burned raw by salt and sun, his spirit extinguished long before his body gave out. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She looked wildly into the crowd, her eyes searching for a flicker of mercy in the hardened faces of Rome. She saw none. She saw only Tullius, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the auctioneer. It was time to finish it. "Do I have a bid for the boy?" the auctioneer shouted, raising his wooden gavel. A rough-looking foreman from the mines raised a hand. 50 denarii. Livia's heart stopped. She squeezed her son's shoulder so tightly, he let out a small cry. She could not breathe. The sun, the noise, the jeering faces, all faded into a roaring whiteness. The only thing she saw was the auctioneer's arm, the gavel held high, a wooden moon promising an eclipse from which her family would never emerge. 50 denarii going once, the auctioneer's voice echoed in the sudden silence of her terror. He looked at Tullius, who was now smiling openly. Livia sank to her knees, her strength gone. She wrapped her arms around both her children, a final, futile embrace. "Going twice," the auctioneer bellowed, his eyes gleaming. The gavel began to fall. A shadow fell across the block, a sudden eclipse. The gavel stopped inches from the wood. A voice, not loud but carrying the weight of command, cut through the expectant silence. It was a voice that sounded like it was torn from the earth itself, rough and immovable. 10,000 denarii. The words hung in the hot air, nonsensical. The crowd, which had been a single jeering beast, became a collection of confused individuals. Heads turned, murmuring spreading like fire through dry grass. Who had spoken? The price was an absurdity, a fortune for a legionary, let alone a single slave boy. The auctioneer, Cassian, blinked, his face a mask of foolish disbelief. 10,000? For the boy? Who dares? The crowd parted, not by choice, but by a primal instinct to give way. A man strode through the opening, his every step a measured beat of purpose. He was tall, built not with the soft bulk of a senator, but with the dense, hard muscle of a lifelong soldier. He wore a simple, dark tunica, but it did little to hide the sheer presence of the man. His face was a testament to the brutality of the empire's frontiers. A long, jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent, grim line. It was a face that promised no comfort. Whispers identified him before he reached the platform. General Titus Cassius, the Iron Ghost, commander of the 9th Legion, a man who had not been seen in the social circles of Rome for years, a recluse, who preferred the company of soldiers and ghosts. Livia looked up from her knees, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Cassius was a legend, a brutal but effective tool of the emperor. He was a man of violence and solitude. What could such a man want with her son? Cassius stopped before the platform, his gaze fixed on the auctioneer. He ignored the whispers, the stares, and the palpable shock of the crowd. He ignored Senator Tullius, whose face had paled, his victorious smirk vanishing like a wisp of smoke. The general's world seemed to contain only himself and the man on the block. "Did I stutter?" Cassius asked, his voice low and dangerous. The auctioneer swallowed hard. "General, a most generous bid. The boy is yours." Cassius did not even glance at Valerius. His cold eyes swept over Livia, then to the small girl hiding behind her. "I did not bid for the boy," he stated, the words cracking like a whip. "I bid for the lot, the mother, the son, the daughter, all of them. 10,000 denarii each." A collective gasp went through the forum. 30,000 denarii. It was a political statement. It was madness. It was an insult to every other bidder and to the very process of this degradation. The auctioneer was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Livia felt the world tilt on its axis. She stared at the scarred general, trying to decipher the unreadable flint of his eyes. There was no pity there, no kindness. There was only an unyielding, absolute resolve. He was not rescuing them. He was acquiring them. Without waiting for the auctioneer's stammering acceptance, Cassius reached for a heavy leather pouch tied to his belt. With a single, fluid motion, he tossed it onto the platform. It landed with a deafening thud, the bag splitting open upon impact. A river of gold auri and silver denarii spilled across the dusty wood, a king's ransom glittering mockingly in the harsh sun. The sound silenced every last whisper. It was the sound of absolute power. Cassius stepped onto the platform, his heavy leather boots making the wood groan. He walked past the stunned auctioneer, his gaze finally falling on Livia, still kneeling amidst her children. He towered over them, a mountain of a man casting them in his shadow. For a wild, terrifying moment she thought he meant to strike her. His presence was overwhelming. He smelled of iron and old leather, the scent of the legions, the scent of the frontier. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He looked down at her, a broken woman, and at her terrified children. His scarred face remained a mask of stone, his motives locked away behind eyes that had seen too much death. All he said was, "Get up." The command was not cruel, but it was absolute. Livia's body, numb with shock, obeyed. She rose unsteadily to her feet, pulling her children with her. Valerius and Valeria hid behind her, their small hands clutching her tunic, peeking out at the giant who now owned them. General Cassius did not look at them again. He turned his back and strode toward the edge of the platform, the sea of onlookers receding before him as if he were a force of nature. He did not offer them a hand down. Livia had to navigate the steep steps herself, half carrying a weeping Valeria. They followed in his wake, a trio of ghosts trailing a storm. The jeers of the forum had died, replaced by a thick, curious silence. They were no longer objects of scorn, but of mystery. To be bought by the Iron Ghost was a fate no one could comprehend. As she walked, Livia could feel the burning stare of Senator Tullius on her back, a promise of a hatred that was far from satisfied. A simple, unmarked cart waited at the edge of the forum. Cassius gestured for them to get in, and Livia huddled in the back with her children, drawing them close. The general sat beside the driver, his back to them, a rigid wall of muscle and silence. The journey through the streets of Rome was a blur. Livia tried to whisper soothing words to the twins, but her own heart hammered against her ribs. Every clatter of the cart's wheels on the stone road seemed to ask the same questions. Who was this man? Why had he done this? What would he demand of them in return? They left the crowded heart of the city behind, traveling along the Appian Way. The villas grew larger, set further back from the road behind high stone walls. Finally, the cart slowed and turned through a massive iron gate, stopping in a barren gravel courtyard. Livia looked upon her new home. It was less a villa and more a fortress. The walls were high and unadorned, the windows narrow slits. There were no welcoming gardens, no vibrant frescoes on the outer walls. It was a place built for defense, not for living. It was a reflection of its master. Cassius led them inside. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them with a deep boom that echoed like a cell door shutting. The atrium was vast, cold, and silent. The floors were polished grey marble, reflecting the light from the open roof with a sterile gleam. There were no ancestral busts in the alcoves, no colourful murals depicting gods or legends. There was only stone, order, and an unnerving emptiness. The air was still and smelled faintly of beeswax and cold stone. Her old home had smelled of baked bread, blooming roses, and her husband's papyrus scrolls. This place smelled of nothing. Their footsteps were the only sound as Cassius led them down a long, echoing corridor. The villa was immense, yet it felt profoundly unoccupied. They passed room after room, all sparsely furnished with heavy, dark wood furniture, arranged with military precision. There was no clutter, no sign of life, no hint of a woman's touch. It was not a home, it was a barracks, it was a tomb. Livia clutched her children's hands tighter. This silent, ordered world was in some ways more terrifying than the chaos of the forum. It was the home of a man who had walled off his heart as surely as he had walled off his property. At the end of the corridor, Cassius stopped. He pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing a suite of rooms. A large chamber with 3 simple but well-made beds, a small table and a chest. A window looked out onto a small walled-off garden, overgrown and neglected. Like everything else, the rooms were impeccably clean, but devoid of any personal touch. Livia waited, her body tense. This was it. This moment he would tell her what she was here for. To be his servant, his concubine, to scrub these cold floors until her patrician hands bled. She braced herself for the terms of her servitude, the price for her children's lives. General Cassius stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking out the light from the hall. He looked at them for a long moment, his gaze sweeping from Livia to the 2 small, trembling children beside her. His scarred face was as unreadable as ever. The silence, stretched, thick with Livia's unspoken fears. When he finally spoke, his voice was the same low, rough sound from the forum, but it held no command, no threat. It was simply a statement. "You are safe here." He did not wait for a reply. He turned and walked away, his footsteps receding down the long hall until they were swallowed by the immense, oppressive silence of the villa. Livia stood frozen in the doorway, watching the empty corridor. She looked down at Valerius and Valeria, whose wide eyes were full of confusion. She pulled them into the room and slowly sank onto one of the beds, the first soft thing she had felt in what felt like a lifetime. They were safe. The word echoed in the quiet room. Safe from the mines, safe from the jeering crowds, safe from Tullius. But she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that they were now captives in this silent fortress, wards of a man whose heart was as barren and desolate as the stone halls around them. She could finally breathe, but the air in this sanctuary was colder and thinner than any she had ever known. Days bled into one another, each marked by the same unnerving quiet. A routine formed, governed by silence. Livia and the children lived within their wing of the villa, attended by two discreet servants who moved like shadows and spoke only when necessary. They were fed, they were clothed, they were safe, but they were utterly alone, ghosts in a house already haunted by them. General Cassius was a phantom in his own home, a fleeting presence at dawn in the training yard, a heavy footstep in the corridor late at night. He never spoke to them. He rarely even looked at them. The autumn air began to carry a chill that the thin slave tunics could not keep out. Livia would wash them each evening, her heart aching as she saw how worn and threadbare they had become. One morning, she opened her door to find a small, neatly wrapped parcel on the stone floor. There was no note. Inside, folded with military precision, were two new tunics for the children. They were not the rough wool of commoners, but a soft, high-quality weave, dyed a deep blue for Valerius and a soft green for Valeria. Livia ran the material through her fingers, her throat tightening. It was an act of provision, not of kindness, a quartermaster supplying his troops. Yet, as she dressed her children in the warm, soft garments, a fragile, unwanted flicker of gratitude took root in her heart. Her window looked out onto the small, neglected garden. It was the only chaotic space in the general's relentlessly ordered world. Weeds choked the life from a few hardy rose bushes, and the stone basin of a small fountain was cracked and dry. Livia found herself drawn to it. She needed to feel the soil, to bring something back to life, to impose her own small piece of order on the world. She began to work with her bare hands, pulling at the stubborn weeds until her fingers were raw. The next afternoon, propped against the garden wall, was a set of fine gardening tools, a small hand rake, a trowel, and iron shears. She saw no one leave them, but she knew. She picked them up, the smooth wood of the handles feeling solid and real. For the first time since she had lost everything, she felt a sliver of purpose. Cassius watched her from the high, narrow window of his study. He watched as she cleared the weeds, as she turned the soil, as a small patch of dark, fertile earth emerged from the desolation. He had not set foot in that garden since his wife, Helena, had planted the original roses. Livia's presence there was a trespass on sacred ground, yet he found he could not command her to stop. He was a general, but in this quiet war against the ghosts of his own house, he had no strategy. He saw the boy Valerius linger near the edge of the training yard, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination as he stared at the racks of wooden swords. The boy needed a father, a guide. Cassius only knew how to be a commander. One afternoon he saw the boy trace the outline of a gladius in the dust with his finger. Cassius strode into the yard, his presence causing Valerius to freeze like a startled deer. The general said nothing. He walked to the rack, selected a small, perfectly balanced wooden gladius, its edges blunted for practice. He walked over to the boy, knelt on one knee, and placed the sword in his small, trembling hands, closing the boy's fingers around the hilt. Then he rose and walked, away without a word. A few nights later, a servant brought Cassius his formal toga, cleaned and pressed for an unexpected summons to the emperor's palace. As he put it on, his hand brushed against the embroidered border. He stopped. There had been a small tear there from a snag on a doorway. He remembered being annoyed by it. Now it was gone. He examined the spot closely. It was not the clumsy work of a servant. The threads were woven together in a seamless, intricate pattern, a nearly invisible mend that spoke of patience and skill. It was the work of a noblewoman, a quiet act of care, a silent stitch, mending more than just a piece of cloth. The bond between them was forged in these silences. One evening, a clamour arose from the stables. Corvus, the general's black warhorse, was in a rage, kicking at the walls of his stall, his eyes wild. The stable hands were wary of the beast, a veteran of a dozen battles. Livia, drawn by the noise, heard the panic in the men's voices. She entered the stone stables, a place that smelled of hay and horsehide. Ignoring the warnings, she walked slowly toward the furious animal. She did not speak. Instead, she began to hum. It was a soft, wordless lullaby she used to soothe Valeria's nightmares, a simple, gentle melody. Corvus stopped his kicking. The great head lowered, the massive chest ceased its heaving. The horse's ears twitched, and he let out a low, shuddering breath. Livia reached the stall and slowly, carefully, extended, a hand resting it on the stallion's powerful neck, her soft humming never ceasing. Cassius arrived in the stable doorway, having been alerted to the commotion. He stopped, hidden in the shadows, and watched. He saw her, this woman of quiet sorrows, calming the untamable beast that even his bravest legionaries feared. He heard the melody, a sound of such profound gentleness it felt alien in his harsh world. It was a sound of life, of healing, in the echoing silence of his heart. As if sensing his presence, Livia turned. Her humming faded. Her eyes met his across the dusty shaft of moonlight slanting through the stable door. For the first time, her gaze was not filled with fear or uncertainty. It was steady, and in his eyes, for just a fleeting second, the iron mask of the general cracked, revealing a deep, aching vulnerability. They stood there for a long moment, caught in a silent understanding, a conversation that needed no words, acknowledging the fragile peace each had brought into the other's lonely world. The fragile truce woven in the silence of the stables held for many days. A quiet understanding now existed between them. Livia no longer felt like a prisoner, and the children began to see the hulking general not as a threat, but as a silent, distant mountain that kept the rest of the world at bay. Valerius would practice with his wooden sword in the yard, and sometimes he would look up to see Cassius watching from his study window before the general quickly stepped away. One afternoon, seeking fresh linens for the children's beds, Livia wandered deeper into the villa than she ever had before. She found herself in a quiet, dusty wing of the house where the air was heavy and still. She passed several closed doors before coming to one at the very end of the corridor. It was different from the others, made of a darker, richer wood, and the handle was of wrought iron, not plain bronze. She assumed it was locked, a place of storage, but some instinct, some gentle pull, made her reach out and test the latch. It clicked. The door was not locked, merely sealed by time and disuse. With a soft groan of protest, it swung inward, opening into darkness. Curiosity warred with her ingrained caution. She pushed the door wider, allowing a shaft of light from the corridor to pierce the gloom. The air that flowed out was cool and carried the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender and cedar. She stepped inside. It was a bedroom. She moved to the window and pushed open the heavy wooden shutters. Afternoon sunlight flooded the room, illuminating a decade of undisturbed dust that danced in the golden beams like 1,000 tiny ghosts. And then she saw it. The room was not for an adult. It was a child's room. A small bed carved with figures of Roman heroes was neatly made, the woolen blanket folded down as if waiting for its occupant to return. On a low shelf against the wall sat a collection of toys, a wooden horse with small wheels, a perfectly crafted miniature catapult, and a line of painted wooden legionaries standing at attention. On a small table beside the bed, a child's wax tablet lay open, etched with the clumsy, half-formed letters of a name, Marcus. Livia felt an icy chill crawl up her spine. This was not a guest room. It was a shrine. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the room near the window. There sat a graceful, high-backed chair, clearly a woman's. Draped over the armrest was a piece of linen, a half-finished work of embroidery. A delicate needle, threaded with deep blue silk, was still resting in the fabric, caught in the middle of forming a flower petal. It was as if the woman stitching it had simply set it down to attend to something for a moment, fully intending to return. In that moment, Livia understood everything: the crushing, oppressive silence of the villa, the stark, joyless order, the general's deep, impenetrable solitude. This house was not empty. It was full to bursting with the memory of a life that had been violently cut short. She felt a profound sense of trespass, as if she had broken into a sacred tomb. This was the room of Marcus, the son of General Cassius, and that was the needlework of his wife, Helena. The narrator's voice would tell the story that Cassius never could. 10 years ago, while Cassius was winning a great victory against the Germanic tribes in the Teutoburg forest, a fever had swept through Rome, a swift, merciless plague that cared nothing for status or power. He had returned a month later, his legion's standards crowned with victory wreaths, only to be met by a silent, empty villa. His son was gone. His wife was gone. His world had ended not in the bloody clash of a shield wall, but in the suffocating quiet of a sick room. The scars on his face were nothing compared to the wound he carried within, a wound of guilt for not being there, a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Livia gently reached out and touched the little wooden horse, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn wood. She imagined a small boy's hand pushing it across the floor, his laughter echoing in a room that had not heard a sound in a decade. A wave of sorrow, so deep and pure it felt like her own, washed over her. The loss of her husband was a fresh, raw wound. This man's grief was an ancient, festering poison. A heavy footstep in the hall made her freeze. Cassius had returned from the city earlier than expected. He found the children's wing quiet, the twins, napping in their beds. He looked for Livia in the garden and saw her tools lying on the turned earth, but she was not there. A cold knot of dread, an unfamiliar emotion, tightened in his gut. He walked through the silent halls of his home, and then he saw it. The door. The one door that was never to be opened. It stood slightly ajar. Rage, white-hot and absolute, surged through him. It was a familiar feeling, an old friend from the battlefield. This was his place, his sanctuary of grief. An unforgivable intrusion. He stormed down the corridor, ready to unleash a fury that had leveled barbarian armies. He reached the doorway and stopped dead. He saw her, bathed in the afternoon light, her hand resting on his son's toy. Her face was not one of idle curiosity. It was a mask of profound, empathetic sorrow. Tears she had not shed for herself were now tracing silent paths through the dust on her cheeks. She was not a trespasser desecrating a tomb. She was a mourner, paying her respects. She heard him and turned, her eyes wide with terror. She saw the general in the doorway and braced herself for the explosion of his wrath. She expected the yelling, the rage, the harsh command to get out, but the rage never came. The anger he had felt moments before evaporated, extinguished by the look on her face. In her eyes he saw his own grief reflected back at him for the first time in 10 years. The iron mask of the general, the stone face of the iron ghost, shattered. What Livia saw in its place was not a fearsome commander, but a man utterly and devastatingly broken. His soul was laid bare in the dusty sunlight, a landscape of ruins, and in that shared, silent moment of profound loss, the true foundation of their sanctuary was finally laid. The shared moment of grief in the dusty room changed everything. The silence that followed was no longer one of emptiness, but of a shared, unspoken understanding. Cassius did not banish her from the room. He simply retreated, leaving the door open behind him. It was a surrender. He was allowing her into his world of ghosts, and in doing so, allowed a sliver of life back into the tomb he had built for himself. The invisible walls within the villa dissolved. Livia moved with a newfound confidence, and the children's laughter. Once a timid whisper began to echo softly in the long corridors, sounds that Cassius found he did not hate. But while a fragile peace settled within the walls of the general's villa, the gears of ambition and revenge continued to grind in the heart of Rome. In his opulent home on the Palatine Hill, Senator Tullius swirled wine in a silver cup, his brow furrowed. His victory over the house of Decimus felt incomplete, a meal that had lacked its final, satisfying course. An informant, a man who specialized in the whispers of the slave markets and the barracks, had brought him unsettling news. The family had not been scattered to the far, forgotten corners of the empire. They were together. They were comfortable. And they were under the protection of the one man in Rome who operated outside the predictable rules of politics. General Cassius. Tullius placed his cup down with a sharp click. This was not a complication. It was a threat. Cassius was a blunt instrument, a man of unshakable loyalty to the emperor and little patience for the machinations of the Senate. He could not be bought, bribed, or intimidated. His reputation was forged in blood and victory, making him untouchable. And under his roof the son of Decimus lived. The narrator would know the shape of Tullius's fear. In the viper's nest of Roman politics, the son of a murdered rival was like a seed of hemlock. Left to grow, it could blossom into a poisonous rebellion. Young Valerius, in 10 years' time, could become a rallying point for all the senators who secretly despised Tullius. He would have his father's name, his mother's dignity, and the patronage of a legendary general. The thought was intolerable. The boy had to be removed. The entire bloodline had to be scoured from the earth. He could not use assassins. An attack on the villa of General Cassius was unthinkable. It would be an act of war against the emperor's favored commander. Tullius, a man who lived by the sword of politics, would have to use a different weapon. He would use the one thing Rome prided itself on above all else, its law. He spent days closeted with lawyers, ambitious young men with sharp minds and flexible morals. Together, they constructed a legal argument of impeccable, cold-blooded logic. The property of a convicted traitor, they argued, was forfeit to the Roman state in its entirety. This included not just land and gold, but flesh and blood. The auction at which Cassius had purchased them was merely an administrative function to convert state assets into coin for the treasury. Tullius's plan was to argue that the sale itself was improper, that General Cassius, in an act of misguided sentimentality, had interfered with the due process of the state. The family, especially the children of the traitor, were still technically the property of Rome, and it was the Senate's duty to dispose of that property in a manner that best served the security of the Republic. He presented his petition on the floor of the Senate. He stood before his peers, his voice ringing with false piety and civic duty. He did not speak of his personal hatred for Decimus. He spoke of tradition, of precedent, of the harsh but necessary example set by their ancestors. To allow the children of traitors to flourish is to plant the seeds of future treason, he declared, his gaze sweeping across the faces of men who all had their own rivals, their own fears. Mercy to the wolf is cruelty to the sheep. The boy must be sent where he can never become a threat. The salt mines of Ostia are a fitting place for the son of a man who sought to sour the state of Rome. His words found fertile ground in the paranoid hearts of his fellow senators. They voted to establish a commission to review the legality of the sale. It was a victory. The wheels of the state were now turning in his favor. Back at the villa, the world was small and safe. Livia was in her garden, which was now a place of thriving life. The rose bushes were pruned and blooming, and she had planted rows of herbs that scented the air with lavender and mint. Valerius and Valeria were playing near the fountain, which now flowed with clean water. For the first time in months, Livia felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips. The peace was real. The sound was jarring, a violation of the quiet sanctuary, the deep, groaning complaint of the great iron gate being opened. It was a sound Livia had not heard since the day she arrived. She stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands, her heart suddenly beating faster. Standing in the center of the courtyard, his red-plumed helmet catching the sun, was a Praetorian centurion. He was not a legionary from Cassius's command. He was one of the emperor's guard, a messenger from the heart of power in Rome. He held a sealed scroll, the insignia of the Senate stamped into the dark red wax. The centurion's gaze swept the courtyard until it fell on her. "I have a summons for General Titus Cassius," he announced, his voice formal and devoid of emotion. Livia froze. The scroll, the insignia, the guard's implacable stance, it was all an echo of the day her world had ended. The outside world, with its laws and its schemes and its bottomless cruelty, had found them. The shadow that she had prayed was gone had returned, stretching its long, cold fingers over the wall of their sanctuary, and in the center of that shadow stood the unmovable figure of Senator Tullius. Cassius appeared in the archway of the atrium, his presence instantly commanding the courtyard. He walked to the Praetorian centurion, his face a mask of cold iron. He took the scroll without a word, broke the wax seal with his thumb, and his eyes scanned the formal script. Livia watched his expression, searching for any sign, any hint of what was to come. She saw nothing but the hardening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. It was the look of a commander assessing an enemy's battle lines. He dismissed the messenger with a curt nod. As the great gate boomed shut once more, sealing them back inside their sanctuary, the fragile peace of the last few weeks shattered like glass. Livia's hard-won hope crumbled into dust. She knew the language of those scrolls, the cold, inexorable power of Roman law when wielded as a weapon. It had taken her husband. Now it had come for her children. She saw the salt mines in her mind again, a vivid, horrifying image. That evening, the villa was plunged back into a silence deeper and colder than before. Cassius retreated to his study, a room Livia had never entered. She could not rest. The thought of waiting passively for their doom was a torment she could not bear. Taking a deep breath, she walked the long corridor and stopped before his door. For the first time, she was not coming to him as a victim, but as an ally. She knocked. When he bade her enter, she found him standing over a large table, not with the summons, but with a map of Germania spread out before him. He was a soldier trying to solve a problem of words and whispers with the strategies of a battlefield. He looked up, his eyes weary. The invincible general lost in a war he did not know how to fight. "They will not win," Livia said, her voice quiet but firm, startling them both with its strength. Cassius looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "The law is on his side, Livia. The commission is a formality. Tullius controls the Senate." "Then we will not fight him in the Senate," she replied, stepping closer to the table. "My husband, Decimus, was not a fool. He knew Tullius was a snake, coiling around him for years. He told me once, a wise man keeps a record of his enemies' sins, for they are the sharpest sword he can possess." Cassius straightened, his full attention now on her. "A record? A ledger," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He kept it hidden. A complete accounting of Tullius's corruption. Bribes from foreign kings, illegal grain speculation, the names of the men he paid to bear false witness. It is all there. The proof of the very treason he pinned on my husband." A new light entered the general's eyes. This, he understood. Evidence. A target. Where? Was his only question. "In the library of our old villa," she explained, her memory sharp and clear. "Beneath the mosaic of Odysseus. There is a single black tile in the border, under the writing desk. It is loose. The ledger is beneath it." He stared at her for a long moment, seeing not the broken woman from the slave block, but a patrician's daughter, with a mind as sharp as any senator's. He saw a partner. He saw a shield. He gave a single decisive nod. "I will retrieve it." You. Next morning, Cassius did not prepare for the Senate. He donned the polished bronze cuirass and the deep red cloak of a general of Rome on official duty. He rode not to the Curia, but to the grand villa on the Quirinal hill that had once been Livia's home. The estate was sealed, guarded by men loyal to the Senate Commission. They moved to block his path, but stopped when they saw who he was. No one dared to physically bar the way of the emperor's most feared commander. He dismounted and strode, past them as if they were statues. He walked through the silent, dust-sheeted rooms of Livia's past. He saw the ghosts of a life he had never known, a life of warmth and family. He found the library, just as she had described. He located the desk, knelt, and ran his fingers along the intricate mosaic border. He found the loose tile. Prying it up with the edge of his dagger, he uncovered a small, hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the damp, was a thick ledger bound in dark green leather. He did not open it. He tucked it securely inside his cloak and left the villa, his mission complete. But he did not ride back to his own home, and he did not ride to the Senate, to the snake pit, where Tullius was the master. He rode directly to the Palatine Hill, to the sprawling fortified palace of the emperor himself. His reputation preceded him. The Praetorian guards, the powerful senators, the fawning courtiers, all stepped aside. A general like Cassius did not seek an audience with the emperor unless the matter was one of life and death for the empire. He was granted immediate entry. He found the emperor in his private study, a room that looked down upon all of Rome. Cassius knelt, then rose at the emperor's command. He did not speak of the summons or of Livia or of the children. He was a soldier delivering intelligence to his supreme commander. I have uncovered a plot against the integrity of the Senate and the security of Rome, Caesar, Cassius said, his voice level. He pulled the green ledger from his cloak and placed it on the marble table between them. The evidence of Senator Tullius's treason is within, the very crimes for which he had the loyal Senator Decimus executed. The emperor, an aging man with eyes that missed nothing, looked from the grim face of his general to the book. He opened it. His finger traced the neat columns of figures, the lists of names, the detailed accounts of corruption and conspiracy. He read for a long time, the silence in the room growing heavier with every page he turned. Finally he looked up. His expression hardened into a mask of cold fury. He closed the book with a soft, final thud. He looked past Cassius to the captain of his personal guard, who stood waiting by the door. "Arrest Senator Tullius," the emperor commanded, his voice quiet, but laced with deadly venom. "Bring him to me. Now." The wait was the hardest part. Hours stretched into an eternity, each tick of the water clock in the atrium a measure of Livia's anxiety. Cassius had ridden into the heart of the beast, armed with nothing but a book of secrets. Livia put the children to bed, telling them a story of brave Odysseus, her voice calm, while her own heart was a storm of fear. She could not rest. She waited in the atrium, sitting in a simple wooden chair near the hearth, where a low fire burned against the night's chill. Every gust of wind, every distant dog's bark, was the sound of her fate being decided. The villa was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the oppressive emptiness of a tomb, but the quiet tension of a vigil. She was waiting for her general to return from the war. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was not her master, not her owner. In the crucible of the last day, he had become her champion. It was well past midnight when she heard it. The groan of the outer gate, the sound of a single horse on the gravel, the heavy thud of the main doors. Cassius entered the atrium, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He was alone. He looked weary, the lines on his face carved deeper by exhaustion. He stopped when he saw her waiting, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the firelit space. Livia rose slowly, her hands clasped before her, her unspoken question hanging in the air. He walked toward the hearth, the metal clasps of his cloak chiming softly with each step. He did not look at her, but stared into the dancing flames. "It is done," he said, his voice low and rough. "Tullius has confessed to the emperor. His properties are forfeit to the state. His name will be struck from the records. He will be exiled to a barren island in the Aegean by week's end." The words washed over Livia, a wave of relief so powerful her knees felt weak. It was over. The ghost that had haunted her, that had murdered her husband and tried to destroy her children, was vanquished. Not just defeated, but erased. A profound shuddering sob of gratitude escaped her, the first sound of true emotional release she had allowed herself. But as the relief settled, a new, quiet uncertainty took its place. The threat was gone. Her name was cleared. Justice had been served. The reason for her presence here, the foundation of their strange arrangement, no longer existed. He had brought her to protect her from Tullius. Now that Tullius was gone, what was she? What were her children? Were they simply guests in this house, soon to be sent on their way? Cassius felt the shift in the room. He had returned from the palace not to a cold, empty barracks, but to a home. He had returned to a woman waiting for him by the fire. As he stood before the emperor, he had realized he was not fighting for the memory of Senator Decimus. He was fighting for the quiet woman who tended his garden, for the small boy who practiced with a wooden sword in his courtyard, for the little girl whose laughter was a sound he had never known he needed to hear. He was fighting for his family. The realization had terrified him, and it had saved him. He turned from the fire to look at her. He saw the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear of a future once again unknown. He had spent his life giving commands, moving legions, conquering lands, but the next words he had to say were more important than any order he had ever given. He looked past her, down the long, dark corridor that led to the children's rooms. Then his gaze returned to her, and it was stripped of all its iron, all its defenses. It held the vulnerability of the man he had shown her in his son's dusty room. "Livia," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He stopped, corrected himself, and spoke the words that truly mattered. "This is your home now, for always." It was not a command. It was not a statement of ownership. It was a vow. It was an offer of a permanent sanctuary, not from the enemies of Rome, but from the sorrows of the world. It was everything. Tears welled in Livia's eyes, but these were not tears of grief or fear. They were tears of a peace so profound it felt like coming home after a lifetime in exile. Words were useless, too small for the magnitude of this moment. She walked to him, closing the small distance between them. He had his hand resting on the stone mantle of the hearth, a scarred, calloused hand that had wielded a sword and held the fate of thousands. Slowly, she reached out and placed her own hand over his. The contrast was everything. Her skin, soft and smooth against his, rough and marked by a life of war. It was the meeting of the garden and the battlefield, of healing and of strength. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand, his large, strong fingers gently closing around hers. A silent pact was sealed in the warm glow of the fire, a promise of a future to be built together, not on the ashes of what they had lost, but on the solid, quiet ground of what they had found in each other. The name of Tullius was scoured from the stone of Rome. His statues were torn down, his estates given to more loyal men, and his name was damned by official decree, condemned to be forgotten by history. The long shadow he had cast was finally and completely banished, not by the shifting politics of the Senate, but by the quiet courage of a woman and the unbending will of a soldier. His fall was absolute, and in the space his evil had occupied, something new and fragile was allowed to grow. The seasons turned 5 times over. The high, stark walls of the general's villa did not change, but everything within them was transformed. The silence was still there, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the comfortable quiet of a home at peace, a canvas against which the sounds of life were painted. The echo of footsteps was now joined by the laughter of children. The scent of cold stone was now mingled with the fragrance of blooming roses from Livia's garden and the warm, comforting smell of baking bread from the kitchens. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary, not of grief, but of life. In the late afternoon sun, the garden was a riot of color. Here, Livia sat on a simple stone bench, her face serene. The deep lines of sorrow that had once etched her features now softened into lines of contentment. Valeria, now a bright-eyed 10-year-old with her mother's grace, sat at her feet, carefully weaving a garland of ivy and small white blossoms. She hummed the same soft lullaby her mother had once used to soothe a warhorse, a melody that had become the unofficial anthem of their family. Across the lawn, in the training yard, the clash of wood on wood rang out. Valerius, no longer a small, trembling boy, but a strong youth with his father's proud bearing, practiced his sword forms. He moved with a speed and confidence that was a testament to his teacher. General Cassius stood opposite him, not as a commander drilling a recruit, but as a father guiding his son. He parried a clumsy strike from the boy with a gentle turn of his wrist, a rare soft smile touching the corner of his scarred mouth. He was not forging a weapon of war, he was raising a good man. After the lesson was done, Cassius walked over to the bench, his long shadow falling over the 2 women. He rested a hand on Livia's shoulder, a gesture of quiet, everyday affection that spoke more than 1,000 poems. Livia leaned into his touch, her own hand rising to cover his. His skin was still rough and scarred, but to her it was the texture of safety, of permanence. Together, the 4 of them watched as the sun began its slow descent, painting the hills of Italia in hues of gold and crimson. No words were spoken. None were needed. The unspoken vows made by the hearthside 5 years earlier had blossomed into this simple, unshakable peace. The ghosts were gone. The empty rooms of the villa were now filled with the warmth of a family forged not by blood, but by choice. The scarred general who had lost everything had found it all again. The disgraced widow who had been sold for nothing had inherited a kingdom of the heart. Cassius's fingers intertwined with Livia's. They held on, a silent promise in their grip, as their children played in the golden light. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of peace, full of love, full of a life that was, at long last, their own.